Hello, everybody. I really enjoyed talking with you all. It was fun to be able to see your faces and to actually have conversations with you face to face. Um, This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the theories that I would be teaching and that I would have on the licensing exam. In particular, I want to talk about Paulo Freire and Martin Baro, and a little bit about the idea of critical patriotism, which is sort of my one of the things that I've written the most about, a sort of a pet interest of mine. Um, so disclaimers, first of all, your grade's not going to be impacted about whether you accept, reject, adapt, discount, or discredit any of the following things that I share. Nothing that I'm sharing is the truth. These are just some ideas that I have had. These ideas reflect my biases, my histories, my values, and are completely tainted by my own personhood and personal history. And you should know that Latin American originating theories of mental health are not seen as important and that thus are not evaluated by the licensing exam. So the things I share today probably won't be on the license exam. So I hope you'll still find it interesting and valuable, but just know that it's not something that you'll probably need either on the license exam or on my final exam. You'll just be graded on the activity for this week. So I wanted to start off by talking about marriage and family therapy and just the topic of diversity. The field's evolution with respect to diversity, it has really made some strides. There are some really important work that has been done. There's been some really important developments with respect to gender, ethnicity, race, social class, sexual orientation, religion, spirituality, and the interface of power and oppression. And I know that's a focus of your program. However, by and large, and maybe there's some differences in your particular program, which has sort of a unique agenda. There's been a dearth of attention paid to the issue of nationality as an issue that's really important. I myself really sought out diversity focused programs. I found great programs and I learned a lot from them. But from undergrad to throughout my doctorate program, I would say it was primarily focused on US areas of diversity. They would talk about US tensions, US difficulties. It was almost never international in its orientation. That may be evolving some. So the lack of attention to nationality partly reflects a nationalistic bias inherent in the field of family therapy. And I think that anytime that there's power or privilege, there's almost always a blind side to it. Given where the U.S. is in the global power structure, it makes sense that training programs, education fields, and such may not, because of the power of where they are, they may not think about that power. And so it's not surprising that the fields remain mostly blind to the significance of nationality and the dominance of U.S. values. So the blindness might be an example that maybe they may not even know how USC they are, whether that's education or the practice of family therapy. So here's a great example for me. These were popular a couple years back for every job, and this was one I found for therapists. And it says what my mother thinks I do, what society thinks I do, what my clients think I do, what I think I do, and then what I actually do. And I laughed. And then, because of this particular interest of mine, I realized it says therapist. It doesn't say US therapist. And you've got the greatest American hero, you have a US personality, and then particularly that last slide, uh, that is representative of the litigious society of the United States. That is not representative of therapists worldwide that are bound down. And this is tied to like insurance company, the fear of being sued, and all those sort of things. This is the most USC thing, but at first, when you glance at it, maybe you don't see how USC it is. So that's an example of kind of the blindness that I'm mentioning. So kind of a related thought. And remember this I was talking about this back in 2003, talking about it. I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while, so it's not just about what has been going on in recent years. So one question I'm always curious to ask people is, do they think of themselves as patriotic? And usually if I'm doing this in a group and they're around other people, they'll want to clarify, well, what do you mean by patriotic? uh, and that's fair, because it means something vastly different to different people. It comes with a lot of baggage to it. What does it mean? How does your response locate you? Or so think about whatever your response was to that question, and what does that response mean about you and your position within the United States or within the world? And then how does your particular political affiliation influence how you experience this word? And then I could ask the other questions like, what does it mean to be unpatriotic? Um, so, okay, we'll get back to it. Patriotism, I've looked at lots of different possible definitions of it. One of the kind of common themes is captured in that patriotism could be defined by a loving devotion to one's nation and a desire for the nation to be the best that it can be. And then it gets really complicated. So there's been scholars that have suggested that among those who identify more on the politically conservative end of the spectrum, the idea of patriotism is often linked to religious faith, patriotic symbols like the flag, morality, justice, duty, honor, and loyalty. Whereas if you're more on the continuum towards a liberal patriotism, you tend to emphasize things that are like liberty, freedom of speech, multiculturalism, and then calling America on the carpet when they are acting against those ideals. I mean, if you just listed those things without linking them to a party, maybe most people would say all of those things are good. But what has happened more and more as extremism is growing is that only one side of what in the past might have been all of those things, or part of the founding of the country were based on all of those things. Now only half of them are valued uh, often. Okay, so I went on a trip to California, and this is unrelated to anything that I was doing there, but I just happened to be going for a walk. I turned a corner, and there was a major protest happening. I had no idea what the protest was about. But just as I turned the corner, someone walked out into the street, and they said, "Stop killing babies." And then someone else walked and met them and said, "Go take a bath." And I left that scene thinking I'm dumber for having turned that corner. And I bet both of them went home thinking they had really done something. But what had they done? They surely hadn't convinced the other side, and they surely hadn't engaged in any kind of dialogue. And I see this just happening more and more. These differences can lead to extreme polarization um, and a lack of civil discourse. When was the last time you actually heard civil discourse at the political level? You know, these are best-selling books, a little dated now, and I could find newer ones. But Lies and the Lying Liars That Tell Them, A Fair and Balanced Look at the Right, or If Democrats Had Any Brains, They'd Be Republicans. Now, as a therapist, think of what if this was a couple that came in? I mean, we've been talking a lot this semester about multi-directional partiality. We would have to what comes if you have such a attacking sort of approach. What change happens to that happens in that process? We try to facilitate therapeutic dialogues, but are we able to do it when it comes to the topic of politics? Okay, patriotism, we talked about that. What I think we see a lot more examples of is called nationalism. Nationalism is the shadow side of patriotism. It is the belief that one's own nation is superior to all others, and its interests are more important to those of any other nation. Just like any like racism, sexism, any ism that you can think of, there's a version of nationalism is a oppressive force like that. Okay, what I would hope is for there to be more critical patriotism, which we defined as the ability to honestly and fairly reflect and assess the values, history, culture, and traditions of one's country. Inherent in this process is the ability to consider the nation's virtues and vices in a balanced way, or in a grounded way, or in a non-reactive way. That doesn't mean that you don't uh, have strong emotions, but you're not, that your emotions aren't um, making it so that you can also have thought. Okay, so if MFT is to be culturally competent profession, we must understand how nationality as a dimension of diversity and nationalism as an oppressive force shapes the field. Especially important given how the planet is shrinking. With globalization, it doesn't matter where you live within the United States, you're going to be interacting with people either from other nations or with people who have different political leanings as yourself. So it's going to be important that we can tune into ways that national identity influences our capacity to communicate and to relate effectively in an international context. So in the spirit of enhancing awareness and sensitivity with respect to nationality, the field must begin by recognizing how much the US culture shapes what happens in family therapy and what doesn't happen to it. So I thought it was really fascinating this semester as we, when I had my friend talk about the difference of her experience in Mexico versus in Canada, how many people still, because they have been trained in the US, view that only doing paperwork in the ways that have developed in the US is the ethical way. It's it it was an example of the US-ness. So much of the paperwork has nothing to do about clinical care. It has to do with not getting sued, or it has to do with uh, meeting the paperwork requirements for insurance companies and reimbursement. That might be a U.S. blind spot that I was mentioning earlier. So U.S. culture influences what happens in family therapy training and practice in so many different ways. Here's a few that we thought about. One, through the unrecognized influence of US values on how therapists define health and pathology, how they treat human suffering, and how they justify their work. Through the exclusion of international perspectives, issues, and critiques. Just a very side comment, I might talk about this later, but one time APA, the American Psychological Association, put out this survey to people and psychologists in the US, asking whether or not APA should be involved in competency care, like evaluating what was competent mental health care in other nations. And what do you think they voted? Ultimately, they decided, yes, the US should be involved in other areas of the world and helping make sure that competency was being met and evaluating that. Can you imagine the US, though, doing the reverse, that having a group of people in Cambodia or in India or elsewhere have a say on what is considered competency? And having enforce a power to influence what happens in our country? No, it would never happen in reverse. Okay, side comment. Through limited self, the therapist focus on nationality, how much have you thought about how much the U.S. influences what you do and do not do? And for approaches based on the development for the wealthy elite. From the very beginning, most of what has been considered is how to benefit, how to serve those who have economic means, or how to control the poor. Okay, so I mentioned unacknowledges, there's an unacknowledged the way that the U.S. influences what happens. So some of the values, if I were to ask you before I went to the slide, what are U.S. values? You might have struggled. But if you were to say, well, what are some cultural values of Mexico or cultural values of some other nation, you might be able to rattle some off. But we don't think about U.S. values that much and how they come into play. But if you look at the research, some of the values that are out there are capitalism, individualism, equal opportunity, privacy, informality, constant activity and action, achievement, competition, materialism, more of a future orientation, time as a resource to be used, and others. And these kinds of values are seen in so much in what we do. Capitalism and individualism. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So an example might be how these values influence the way the field conceptualizes and treat human suffering. For example, an increased reliance on the DSM. Or being co-opted, like we whatever it is that meets the demands of the insurance company or managed care ends up being seen as competence. Or privileging quantitative methods or standardized lists to define truth or reality. Um, an analysis of data collected by a national sample of MFTs revealed that roughly 2/3 of MFTs use the DSM in their practice, while 91% of clinicians work with clients who are on psychotropic medications that are utilized in accordance with the DSM. There can be no denying that the DSM is decidedly a US invention. It was originally, its origins was a US Army manual. It's now owned and published by the American Psychiatric Association. It is a major moneymaker. So it's very much tied to capitalism. It's tied to our emphasis on money. Consider that the majority of the panel members that are responsible for writing the DSM have undisclosed financial links to pharmaceutical companies. Like, how do you receive major donations or money funding from a pharmaceutical company and not have that have an impact on you? Moreover, the DSM reflects the US value of either or thinking that underpins the notion that health and pathology are discrete, unrelated conditions, and that psychic suffering can be treated biologically, as opposed to, I mean, in many other cultures, indigenous in particular, it might be tied to a connection to nature or a connection to the spiritual world. How did we decide that so many things need to be diagnosed and then treated with a pharmaceutical aid? Maybe because it makes financial sense to do so. So excluding international perspective, I mentioned that. So in training programs, in analysis of the theories, international competencies are evaluated with respect to clinical efficacy. Sorry, that word efficacy. International representation. How many international faculty have you had so much, or supervisors, or guest presenters? How much of a voice do international populations have in training in general in the field? Whose articles are you reading? Are you reading them? I asked a lot of you how many of you. I'm very happy to hear that you were reading some things in Spanish, but what percentage? And then what about beyond Spanish? How many articles did you get access to that were originally written in Arabic or in some other language? Most, and then what is lost because English is being privileged? For most MFTs in the US, at least, they also consider AMFT their professional home as opposed to, for example, IFTA or other international organizations. Self of the therapist. This is one of the ones that I find the most interesting. Like, I looked at all the main self of the therapist articles, and they all list about the same ones. Race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Almost none of them. Well, I don't know if I even found any of them at the time that listed nationality, as if nationality isn't a major influencing factor. And even when they do, like, sort of try to get at sort of how maybe people from the US were influenced ancestrally from other nations, they assume, like for the cultural genogram, it assumes that everyone lives in the US or was born in the US. Okay. And then I mentioned that the approaches, by and large, have been developed for people who have economic means. So I want to talk today a little bit about a theory that usually when I ask people, they really haven't had any exposure to. And it's whenever I have a big group, I ask them, how many of you have been trained in a Latin American originating theory of mental health? And sadly, almost always no hand goes up. Maybe they've had some readings, but theories that actually developed in Latin America are few and far between as far as given training. Okay, so Martin Baro, one of my heroes. One of the quotes that I like best from him is he says, "What is needed is for our most basic assumptions in psychological thought to be revised from the bottom up. But this revision cannot be made from our offices. It has to come from a praxis that is committed to the people. So I'll get into this, but it's a whole revisioning. Like, what if we were to revision the whole thing so that mental health practices were more accessible to people with less economic advantage? Okay, this is not a psychological study, but I found it fascinating. There were interviews with 60,000 poor women and men from 60 different countries around the world. A major theme of the findings revealed that poor people's lives are often characterized by powerlessness and voicelessness. And if you think about that combination, feeling voiceless and powerless, that obviously has a big impact on mental health functioning. So yeah, I just keep thinking about that in terms of our practices, what we do, whether it's where our clinics are located, how people get in front of a mental health worker, provider, a healer, whatever you want to call that. Think about the practice of therapy. Think about all the logistics. One, you have to fill out paperwork, so you have to be literate. One, or you have to find some way to get sitting in a therapy room. Think about how much might stand in the way from someone getting to that place where they can get care from where their lived existence, their reality is at, if they're coming from a place of poverty. These two photos really contrast that for me. So, two introductions. I'm Paulo Freire and Ignacio Martin Baro. You might already be familiar with them, and I don't know what exposure you might have, so forgive me if I'm telling you things that you already know. I want to talk about what it might be if you were sort of liberation oriented in your therapy. So a little bit of background. First of all, I love it. If you come here, we're going to definitely go to the Zocalo, because I think it captures something important about Latin America. You have here the National Palace, which is the government, and it's facing the Catholic Church, and it's built on the ruins of the culture that existed beforehand. So those three things are still ever present in Latin America. Liberation psychology has its origins in liberation theology. So the Catholic Church was part of the overall conquest and colonization of the native people by Spain and Portugal. The conquest brought on a really aggressive, violent form of Catholicism that reflected both the period and the reactions to the Protestant formation. They were out to save people, and if not, they're going to kill them. So it was a very violent period. But there were some early missionaries that protested the cruelty of the conquest. There's a list of them. I won't go through all of them, but these were the sort of like the early origins of sort of this liberation theology, which was this idea that maybe what was happening was not okay. And then during the years of 1808 to 1824, Latin America largely broke away from Spain and Portugal. And so that distance allowed some new ways of starting to think about religion, about spirituality, about that. And since the monasteries, convents, and churches had less contact with the church's official representatives, the Catholicism that developed in Latin America actually ended up taking on its own form and differing in quite some significant ways from the Catholicism of Rome. And out of that was sort of the origins of liberation theology. So some Latin American priests began calling upon the church to have a solidarity with the poor. And then I won't go into all the details with this, but part of the process of liberation theology was sort of just like I was saying with psychology. They just decided, like, what if we're going to revisit all our thinking about the scriptures, but from the vantage point of solidarity with the poor. So collapsing many years, the movement continued. Liberation theology particularly came into its own in the 1960s and combined Christian idea that man is alienated from God and his fellow beings with the idea that of economic and social structures in which human beings live is a fundamental source of alienation. So another way of saying that, in the past, the church would say, you know, if you're poor, that is God's plan for you, and you should learn to accept it. And the new theology was God never wanted you to be suffering this way, and He also supports you changing the social structure that maintains your poverty. Quite a different stance to take. So, as they realized that their theology was emerging out of a particular context, they also began to see that the same was true of any theology, including the theology that they had learned from Europe. And then Latin American theologians found that they were not only dealing with different issues, but that they had their own method and way to engage with theology. Again, with sort of a solidarity. And this is just a faction within Catholicism. By the way, I'm not Catholic. I almost didn't get a job once because they thought I was too Catholic. I just appreciated this process that they went through. So the process that occurred within the Catholicism leading to liberation theology was a model for what then began to occur in terms of psychology. So Ignacio Martin Baro is probably the most well-known for this. He was trained in Chicago in U.S. perspectives in mental health. And then he was sent to El Salvador during the time of the Salvadorian War. He was actually sent to build a church, but said, I'm not going to build a church if people don't have homes. First I'm going to help people find places to live. Anyways, it was so he was simultaneously doing that revision of the views of the scriptures with revisions of psychology. So Martin Baro was a priest and a psychologist, and he saw the limits of individualistic models that would tell him, okay, if someone's depressed, then they must have something wrong with him. But he could see in his own context that they had just lost family members in the bombings that were happening that night, and they didn't have a home, and they were experiencing rapes from the military and so forth. So he started to really think about, okay, it's actually the context that's having impact on people's mental health as opposed to individualistic models. And then, so from a vantage point of Central America enmeshed in military repression, civil wars, and a profound poverty, he saw the psychology's lack of attention to the impact of society on mental health. For me, this is absolutely systemic. Family therapy kind of moved from an individual view to a family view. This is just doing the same process but moving it to a societal one, thinking about the global, the macro system, and the microsystem of the family, and the family also makes sense within the context of society. The individual also makes sense in the context of society. So, drawing on the ideas of liberation theology, he chose the term liberation psychology for this emancipatory approach to mental health. Okay, he drew a lot of his ideas from work that was going on with Paulo Freire. So Paulo Freire is best known for his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This was written for educators, but it's one of the best books I could recommend for people. And so many of you are working with people from Latin American context. Anyways, in general, I think it's one of the best books for therapists. It's heavy. If you want a challenging read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but every time I read it, I take new things from it. It was Paulo Freire's work is directed towards liberating oppressed and often illiterate people in developing world, especially in Central and South America, starting in the 1960s and later. One of the concepts that I for sure want you to take from Paulo Freire is he talked about this culture of silence. That people get submersed in this idea that things are just the way they are and there's nothing they can do about it. For example, in the past, the priest saying it's God's will for you that you live in poverty or oppression or suffer, that this is the cross for you to carry. It's the shift to realizing, no, there's so many other ways to think about it. And if I can think about it differently, then maybe there are things that I could do to change it. So Freire primarily worked in the barrios of rural Brazil, educating the poor. He dedicated his entire life to helping the poor and marginalized people in the world and to gain awareness of the world conditions while assisting them to find creative ways to change oppressive societal structures. He talked about education as being a main way. Uh, Education can be a subversive force. There's no such thing as a neutral education. Whatever you're being taught, it has an agenda behind it. So education either functions to integrate the younger generation into the logic of the present system, and bring about conformity. So it can be an oppressive force, or it can be this practice of freedom, the means by which people deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in transforming the world. So part of us, our job as therapists and as humans, is to think about what part of our cultural logic needs to be subverted. We've just spent a semester talking about the theories that are going to be on licensing exam. There is so much pressure for you to be integrated into the way all therapists are trained. I find value. I love the theories. I think there's value in the theories that you've been learning. Just realize that the conversation isn't over yet, and there might be many other ways to go about healing and change. But first, we have to recognize that we're being socialized, so that maybe we can consider other ways to think about things. Okay, I like, and Ignacio Martin Baro took from, and I think that there's some valuable things to take from Freirean perspectives that can help in liberation psychology's objectives. So one of them is avoiding the banking concept of therapy. I heard many of you talking about this. You don't want to be some expert downloading information into empty vessels. You realize your clients come with knowledge and information and ideas. I think, though, that you can be part of dialogue with them and consciousness raising, helping them become aware of oppressive structures that might be limiting them. But part of that dialogue could also be giving them information that you in your privileged position, and you are in a privileged position if you have access to education. Maybe you know about resources in the community, or maybe you know about things that could be helpful to them. So dialogue doesn't mean that you don't bring something to the table. You can bring something to the table. You just realize that you're not the only one, that your clients are also doing that. Part of any sort of oppressive act that ever has been and ever will be is taking away people's humanity. So a part of the goal is also helping people to get reconnected with their humanity. And a part of humanity is having a voice. So part of that is helping them to regain their voice. And then I'm going to talk about this in a second, but true practice over just theory. So avoiding the banking approach to therapy. In a banking approach, knowledge becomes a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who they consider to know nothing, projecting absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression. And this negates education and the knowledge as a process of inquiry. Avoiding banking approach to therapy opens up a way of being with clients similar to a number of postmodern approaches that trust that clients have their own ways of knowing that can be useful in addressing clinical concerns. I would just like to say my own, repeat myself, just love postmodern approaches. And I worry about people thinking that the conversation's over. Oh, I'm coming from a postmodern approach, then therefore I cannot be oppressive. Check yourself before you wreck yourself with that one. Okay, dialogue and consciousness raising. So dialogue is the alternative to doing banking therapy, and its aim is to bring about a form of consciousness raising. When I was listening to the philosopher Oprah Winfrey's podcast recently, and she kept talking about when you know better, you do better. So part of it is like, yeah, raising your level of consciousness so that you can have new choices. An underlying philosophy of consciousnization is humanism, and the goal is to help people have more options for the expression of their humanity. So the Freire method has provided a model of work in which outsiders, that is, people who are maybe not themselves poor, can go to popular classes in a non-paternalistic way. Peter McLaren wrote that for Freire, schools are places where as part of civil society, spaces of uncoerced interaction can be created. Similarly, therapy can become a type of knowledge lab in which a client constructs new options through dialogue. Okay, humanization. Um, Oppression involves the dehumanization of people. The first step to dehumanizing or to taking away someone's power is to dehumanize them. That's from every oppressive regime ever. You start by calling them names. You start by drawing pictures of them in cartoonish ways, and so forth. Freedom to act for oneself rather than to be acted upon is an essential aspect of regaining and increasing one's humanity. A liberation psychology aims to facilitate breaking out of oppression by identifying processes and practices which can transform the psychological patterns associated with oppression and facilitate taking action to bring about change in social conditions. Got to put a satir quote in there. Over the years, I have developed a picture of what a human being living humanly is like. She is a person who understands, values, and develops her body, finding it beautiful and useful. A person who is real and is willing to take risks, to be creative, to manifest competence, to take change when the situation calls for it, and to find ways to accommodate what is new and different, keeping that part of the old that is still useful and then discarding that part that's not. Um, yeah, a liberation-oriented therapist would try to assist clients in identifying and addressing societal structures that impede achieving and expressing one's full humanity. Really, a lot in common with sort of the experiential models that we spoke about this. And the ability to take risks and to feel like they're also in participation in trying to change oppressive structures. True practice. Okay. Ignacio Martin Baro said that the true practice recognizes that actions are more important than affirmations. And in this context, everything becomes meaningful that mediates the possibility of people's liberation from structures that oppress and impede their life and human development. So because of capitalism, because of competition with insurance companies about who will get reimbursed, the US, it's a tough place because things get put into camps. And really to solve any big problem like poverty, it's going to take multiple different professions. So we can't all be in competition. From a true practice perspective, maybe there would be things that a social worker would do, or a psychologist would do, or a family therapist would do. But from a true practice perspective, you would be doing whatever it is that would help alleviate suffering and pain in a client's life. True practice for a therapist might include engaging in more social justice and change behaviors, helping clients to connect with resources like the psychoeducational things that we've talked about, and to assure that basic needs are met. It would also likely avoid efforts aimed at helping clients adapt their perceptions of internal responses. For like, I'm not gonna, if someone comes in, which happens often, and said like maybe they're having a hard time providing food for their family, then therapy is helping them get food for their family, not change how depressed they are about it. So for example, the goal wouldn't simply be to adjust to oppressive state of poverty. Okay, I think everything makes sense in context. So if we see anything, if we try and understand the context of it, we're going to understand it better. So it's interesting to look at liberation psychology as a thing. Its context origins was El Salvador in 1977, 1989, during the Salvadorian War, in a context of poverty, with a great influence of Catholicism, with the foundation of liberation theology, and it was a rebellion against the dominant psychological thinking. Family therapy, what was its origins? Palo Alto, California, in the United States in 1956. In general opulence, it also was in rebellion about psychological thinking. Think about that with any theory. I love that some of you were talking about, what do I need to understand about where Bowenian therapy and Murray Bowen, how was his context different as he was developing his theories? maybe in contrast to Salvador Minuchin. What was different about his content? I do that with every single theory. Actually, do this with every single idea you're ever presented with. In what context does this make sense? Who does it actually serve, and who does it not serve? And then what are the, what other ways could I think about it other than what's being presented to me? Nothing comes without an agenda. And sadly, almost nothing is disconnected from whether or not it makes money. That's not the same question of whether or not it helps. Okay, few questions just to think about. What would clinical work look like if it addressed the challenges of poverty? How would it have to be different? What would successful therapy look like when working with people experiencing oppression or traumatic societal events? How would we know if a client's humanity is being expanded or limited by a mental health theory? And then think about yourselves being trained within the US or having spent a good portion of your time of your life in the US. How can a clinician trained in the US better develop global perspectives and global competencies?